the Grey Hat Beard podcast.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Grey Hat Beard, show 18, getting near to that big 2-0. In fact, we're adults now, thinking about it, and that makes us legal and for everything. I think I'll leave that there. Moving on very quickly, we're going to now go on to talk about security and compliance with our guest Peter Rising, who's joining us and has quite literally written the book on the subject on there. And what we're going to cover, we're going to first go into the kind of things that can be done. You know, what is security compliance in Microsoft 365? What are the things you can do that can help you be secure and compliant? Then going to talk about probably the question that comes up most with a lot of things when you talk about what you can do. What can you do with the license requirements? So thinking about, we can do either one, E3, E5, all the different areas around that, and how you work out what's available. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the roadmap. We're very aware that next week is Ignite and there's bound to be more things announced, but talking about what we know about is coming up. So really over to, and possibly we'll cover that, what we'd like to see come up as well. I know we did cover a bit of Ignite stuff, but what are the missing bits within the security and compliance that we'd love to see close? And I've just dropped that bombshell on everyone, so a nice bit of the show to think about before we get to that. But really, Peter, over to you as our resident book writer on this. What can you do with Microsoft 365?
Oh, thank you, Kevin. So one of the big challenges of having everything in the cloud in Microsoft 365 is that you can't wrap a traditional firewall around that. And for many years, people were thinking, when M365 was initially getting adopted, it was people thinking of it as Office and email in the cloud. That was the early adoption, early perception of what it could do. But as we all know now, it's evolved and changed so much in the last few years, and it is so much more than that. And this leads to requiring an awareness of the responsibilities that you have to protect the data and the content that you are putting into your M365 environment. So it can be very challenging indeed to be able to do that. I mean, the most basic example of that is thinking about the old world of Exchange on-premises servers. It would be typical to have some sort of backup product to back up those mailboxes in a traditional granular backup and restore methodology. The same principle for any files that were hosted on file server shares. You would typically have a product like Semantic or Veritas Backup Exec, and thinking back to my days as an on-premises.
Many other good products are available.
Many are available, yeah, exactly, quite right. Thinking back to my days as an on-premises IT manager, one of the common ones was people coming to my desk saying, "I've deleted this file. Can you get it back for me? Can you put last night's tape in and restore that file?" In the cloud world, in the Microsoft 365 world, things are very different, because natively, and this is a huge point of contention and quite a divisive subject on its own amongst our community, many disagreements about it. There is no native traditional backup and restore methodology within Microsoft 365. What there is instead are a number of features that you can use to protect yourself and protect your data. And you have things along the lines of retention policies, which ensure that the content that you're storing in Microsoft 365, even if your users delete that content, it's going to be retained until such time that retention policy is expires. You can set how long the content is going to be retained for, how long to keep this email, how long to keep this document or this folder. And if a user deletes that content, they may think it's gone, but it's actually going into a secret folder somewhere in Microsoft 365 and can be retrieved. Then what happens after that? Once you come to the end of your protection retention period for that content, there's all sorts of different things that can happen. You can set those policies to delete the content after that time. You can set it to be triggered for a review at that time, or all sorts of things can take place at that point. So that's one way of protecting your data. Another one that is really the IT administrator's best friend in terms of responding to those traditional requests of, I've overwritten this document, can you get it back to how it was yesterday, is the versioning controls within Microsoft 365. So if you're working on a file within Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint document library, if you have versioning enabled within your tenant, this is something you can easily educate your users to take advantage of, and they love it. There's major versioning and minor versioning available. You can set that in your tenant for what you want it to be, and then the users themselves can be shown how to go into the documents within the doc libraries, click on the drop down, look at the version history, and say, oh, I want this one from 2 days ago. I'm going to make that the current version. So there's things like that as well. All sorts of great features like EDiscovery, litigation hold, things that are going to protect you and make sure you are adhering to the regulatory
just
compliance.
For any listeners who are hearing that, what's meant by EDiscovery?
EDiscovery is essentially a search tool which is included within Microsoft 365, and it goes so far depending on the level of licensing that you have. And we'll touch on licensing a little bit further down the line in this podcast. But with EDiscovery, first and foremost, this is a tool within the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center, which you can reach from protection.office.com, one of the many.
Oh, you're getting into a dark territory there. Where you can reach them from.
Yeah, I am for sure. But there are so many different ways to get to the same contents. There is no one portal to rule them all, but that's another discussion point for sure. But
I think there's 2 portals to confuse them all, isn't there?
Wow.
Yes. Exactly.
One thing I hope from Ignite, they actually just tie that down. So there's only protection, and there's one for security, one for compliance.
And I think we're heading in that direction. I mean, the security and compliance.
Just very quickly for people who are listening and don't know what we're talking about, there was the old, I think it's fair to the old protection one, which combined security compliance. Yes. There's newer portals now which split out security compliance. I think there's a lot of confusion of finding things in the newer portals aren't always as obvious as knowing where to go. So I think certainly if you look at a lot of the documentation of things, it points back to the old way of doing things. And I think what Al's alluding to there is confusion. So if you're going into security and compliance, you will generally be encouraged to look at the new one. If you go to the documentation, a lot of it refers to the older portals on there. And so I think this is why I was saying, hopefully,
so yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes this area complicated is that the security compliance that we're talking about here, there's elements that are related to Office 365. Which just relate, they only relate to the storage in Office 365, but then there's elements that come from Azure. There's elements of Intune that, is device management. And now we've got, with the Microsoft 365 scope, we also have Windows 10. So we have endpoint protection on devices, and then you have Azure as well. So there's so many different areas that we're talking about here, but we're trying to focus just on the Microsoft 365 space, but it easily bleeds into those other areas, which does make it more complex.
It really does. It's almost impossible not to get drawn into those other portals. A good example of that would be sensitivity labels and Azure information protection. That's accessible all over the place. You can access it in the Azure portal, the security and compliance portal, and the compliance portal. And I think you're entirely right. I think Microsoft are leading us, wanting us to go to those dedicated security and compliance portals, the separate ones.
So Peter, let me ask you a question. So if I were new to this subject area, two words that you've used quite a lot, security and compliance.
Mm.
What would you say are the definitions for what those two encompass? Because as a layperson, you might look at a lot of the features and go, actually, that all seems quite similar. So
how would you interviewing at the moment? That's a lovely interview question.
It is, isn't it? It is. And it's a very good question indeed. And there is a lot of bleed between those features. As you say, there are things that do cross over. But essentially, my own take on this, at the very least, is that security relates to things like protecting yourself from threats like malware, like phishing, anything that would be included in, for example, Office 365 advanced threat protection to stop malicious actors getting into your environment and then doing all sorts of nasty stuff. It's at its core, it's with the intention of stopping these awful people getting into your environment, even at a very basic level, and then preventing lateral movement, elevation of privilege. And because if they get their hands on those privileged accounts, if they're patient enough and get persistence in that environment, they can do some real damage. So that's really the core of security when we think about protecting our endpoints with things like Windows Defender and or Microsoft Defender, as it now is, and Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. It's really to address those threats and to be aware of those threats and to ensure that we're doing everything we can to protect ourselves.
I think it was interesting what you were saying at the beginning, that the kind of more traditional world was focused so much on those firewalls, stop people getting in.
Yeah.
The kind of evolving one, especially as we get cloud, there are so many different endpoints that instead of focusing on stopping people getting in, it's stopping data, stopping people being able to move around within there is the absolute key. It's a different way of thinking about things.
And we're now evolving to this zero trust.
Yeah.
Methodology, which is becoming more and more prominent. That's a term we're hearing more and more, zero trust methodology in relation to cloud presence. But so that's security. Compliance, on the other hand, focuses more on things like any industry or regulatory compliance standards that you may have to adhere to. Is one example, but there are global compliance principles that we all have to have in mind when we think about data that we are going to have within Microsoft 365. Any intellectual property, any personal data, which will inevitably be stored in Microsoft 365, has to be appropriately protected with compliance principles in order to ensure that data is not lost or leaked or ends up in the wrong hands. And that can be things like data loss prevention is one of the great features that will prevent the accidental sharing of sensitive information such as credit card numbers, medical information, and there is a whole host of sensitive information types that are built into Microsoft 365 that relate to things like PII and GDPR, and you can go and pick those and apply them and make sure.
I think GDPR, for everyone's heard about GDPR, is probably the most obvious example for people for a something that you've got to follow for compliance. That's very much about that PII, that personally identifiable information, making sure you understand how you're using people's data correctly, and helping advise you on the right way to do it. Won't protect you completely. You still need to have your plans in place, but helping with those policies.
Yeah. Compliance is the hardest part of it. Security, in theory, if you do it right, is easy because you know what you have to do. Compliance, one of the biggest mistakes that gets made is that business leaders think it's an IT problem, but it's really not. IT can guide on this and make recommendations on the technologies, but the decisions on what needs to be the standards that need to be set and the protection that needs to be put in place is really a business decision, because those business leaders are going to know about the compliance standards that they need to adhere to. IT people are not going to know that so much. So that's key to getting it right.
I think that's absolutely key, because whenever I work with clients, if this is the subject, if the compliance is the subject, and even security, I want to be speaking to the data protection officer. I don't want to be going and speaking to IT. I want to be speaking to the person who actually has the responsibility in law for protecting that data, and then say, this is how the technology can support the policies that you want to implement. And it's absolutely crucial that you speak to the right people here. You need IT involved. They're supporting the systems that are going to support the compliance with those policies. But I think it's all in the name, isn't it? Compliance means there is something you are compliant to.
And
Exactly.
I think that's a good reminder. It's both sides. You need people to find how they want to work, and you need your IT and security people to say, well, this is what you need to be able to do, because it's not. A lot of people often see security and compliance as just the gatekeepers. You can't do this, you can't do that. But a good security and compliance area will work to understand what you want to do and help people to do that in the right boundaries as well. So again, it's collaboration, it's working together. It's not just stopping people doing things. It's allowing people to do things in the right way.
So if you were to go into an organization and they were to say, well, we don't really know what we need to adhere to, but we haven't had these capabilities. What advice would you give to them in terms of how to identify, where they are and what actions they actually need to take?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And I think if they don't have an idea themselves, or they don't have an appropriate compliance body within their organization, I would always start with a few key things. I would take a look first at enabling the audit log within Microsoft 365 and let that run for a time. I mean, audit logging within M365 is something that now in newer tenants, I believe, or maybe I'm right on this, I think it's enabled by default now. Previously, it was something you had to enable. And it took a little while to come live and start recording stuff. But now,
always longer than you wanted.
Yeah, exactly. But that is going to capture so much good stuff that when you drill down into that, you can see exactly what is being shared, exactly what sort of activities people are doing within your environment. And from that, you can get an idea of the sort of things that you need to start protecting. And where I always recommend starting is with data loss prevention. And the reason I go with that first is because majority of my customers are more likely to be immediately licensed for that, because DLP comes with Office 365 licensing plans, E3, E1, which is where majority of business enterprise customers in the last few years have fallen. More recently, the more advanced licensing plans like EM&S and Microsoft 365 are gradually becoming
enterprise mobility and security, isn't it?
Correct, yes, enterprise mobility and security. Those licensing options are gradually becoming less of a nice to have than they used to be, and more of a must in some way, shape or form. But to get some of the more advanced features like sensitivity labels or information protection, you need to step up to that level of labeling. And if you can't do that immediately, then you can get some quick wins to protect yourself by implementing data loss prevention, DLP. And the really good thing about DLP is that it again leverages those built-in sensitive information types that I mentioned earlier, things like that PII information, medical information, and financial information, which you can select by country and so on and so forth. And you can set these policies up in a number of different ways to and test them out before you implement them. So if you're worried about breaking things and stopping your users from being productive, then what you have is the option to set these DLP policies up in test mode with notifications. And what that will do is it will audit what the effect of a policy match would be, which M365 administrators can then take a look at, or get email alerts on, or go and interrogate the logs. And also from a user standpoint, it's going to educate your users with policy tips, which are really useful. The policy tips will be a very visual sort of bar that pop up in their M365 applications in Word or Excel or PowerPoint, and it'll pop up and say, oh, you're putting a credit card in this document. Are you sure you want to do that? And you can take that decision as far or as little as you want. You can let them ignore that. You can let them override that, but force them to put in a justification, explanation as to why they're overriding it, which is then audited for record, or you can prevent them from doing so. So
I think that's really interesting. I've been, as part of my knowledge management series, been reading a lot on knowledge management and listening to books on that. And one of them from APQC, and I'll try to remember what that's called at some point, but the American best practice on productivity and I think it's quality center. They talk about teachable moments and having that pop up at that point you try and do something. They've done various studies that prove that you will learn a lot more, remember a lot more if you hit at that exam point. That teachable moment is absolutely key, and I think the security and compliance does some great jobs with that.
They really do. They really do. There's a lot to draw the user's attention right to it and forces them to address that issue, that challenge, that message before they can move on. So that's where I would start. DLP. Definitely. I would also look to getting some sort of retention policies in place to protect the content that you have in Microsoft 365.
How do you, so retention policies are, defining how long you retain things for, so even they're deleted, they're stored there.
Yes.
How do you help clients decide what should be stored? What sort of factors do you think about with that?
Again, that comes down to being a business decision, in my opinion anyway. It is something that they have to think in terms of what regulations they are bound by, what industry regulations specifically, or internal policies that they have decided that they have themselves as an organization. So that's why it's important, coming back to the point I made earlier, of getting the right people, the right stakeholders invested in it immediately from the get-go. Otherwise it's not going to work. They have to be involved.
And I think some of those policies, we talked about GDPR, that gives the starting point to define policies, about what the schedule that you want for retention, disposition, but also when you look at, healthcare, there will be industry specific guidelines. So, we do a lot of work with public sector. So, the police have guidelines, the NHS has guidelines for healthcare. Local government, central governments, MOD, all of these have guidelines. And I'd say if you're in an industry where there aren't industry guidelines, try and find policies that are out there that other people are using and use those as a starting point.
There will be white papers, case studies. There's always something.
There's always something
applicable to you that you can get your hands on and take a look at and think, that's going to fit us nicely.
And I think
do what we need.
I think the other thing that I have used quite a lot with clients is, so Microsoft, as part of Microsoft 365, they have the compliance score and they have security score, which essentially are built-in ways of measuring how effectively you have configured and are using the technology to align to particular sets of guidelines. So you can take the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK or the American equivalent NIST and take the security guidelines. You can take GDPR as compliance, and you can actually measure where you are in terms of the compliance, and it will also give you actions and recommendations as to what should you do to increase your score, which is actually really, really useful because it will tell you what you need to do, and then you can manage it as actions as well.
And I think importantly, it's continuous assessment. A lot of these things, people come and engage with a consultant. It's a one-off. Boom, done. Yeah, we're compliant. We can relax. Absolutely not. There are always things changing. There are always compliance regulations changing. There are always things changing in your organisation, whether it is compliance or security. So making sure that it continues to do that. Both the compliance and secure store help that, and we'll put links to those into the show notes.
Completely.
So all of everything that we're talking about, I guess that the
just very quick before we move to the next thing, one thing on the secure store, I just want to highlight that if you don't agree with all those policies, you probably can't quite see it on the video, but you can accept risks. So if things don't apply to you, you don't have to say, oh, I'm only ever going to be 46%. You can sort of say, yeah, we have made a decision, we have accepted that, and you can document and capture that. So it's not a complete one on there.
And very good point.
And I think certainly what I would say is, if you do that, document it, because when you come along in the future, if you have any legislative audit or anything, if you've mitigated those risks, you at least have that to refer to. Whether it was right or wrong, you've got something to refer to. I think the other
decision was made.
Yeah, the other area that really comes in is licensing levels as well. You're only, not everything is available to everybody. The more you pay, the more you have.
Exactly.
Very quickly before we go on to licensing, as I was going to say, we get onto that. I just want to pull slightly back to Peter. You were talking about backup.
Yeah.
And I've had many interesting conversations with people. Do you need a backup system with Microsoft 365? And as a consultant, I say it depends.
You consultant, you.
Yeah,
exactly. It does depend.
But I mean, what are your thoughts on that as to whether you need one, or when would you consider that you should have one versus using what's there and available?
Yeah, I mean, there are a vast number of third-party M365 backup providers out there, so many of them, and they all do slightly different things. No one of them does entirely everything, but there's ones like Druva, there's Veeam, there's Symantec, there's a lot of names in that space.
AppPoint, loads,
yeah, exactly. And what they will do is they will do things in a more traditional, granular backup and restore approach. Now, in my own opinion, I don't think they add a great deal of value. With a caveat, I would say if you are protecting your M365 environment with the appropriate licensing, if you can go as far as licensing to the hilt with M365 E5, which is not going to be cheap for you, then I would say no, you don't need any extra third-party bells and whistles. Only my opinion. If I had some of my colleagues, my consultant colleagues on with me right now, we would have a heck of a debate about this, and we'd have some disagreement for sure. Because the other thing that crops up as well is things like third-party mail flow and mail hygiene solutions like Semantic Cloud, Message Labs, whatever they're calling themselves this week, Mimecast, which are great products. And again, if I had some of my colleagues with me on this podcast, I know 2 or 3 of them would say, you've got to have a Mimecast. It's essential. It's way better than native M365 protection for that sort of thing. Whereas I am more leaning towards if you have M365 E5, you configure it correctly and diligently, then you shouldn't need that. But it's a very divisive debate.
They often make things easier. I think that's the big thing. Not always. They can make it more complex, but they will make it easier to restore things once set up at a
Agreed
cost.
with that. Agreed with that. That is indisputable. Yeah, it's easy to get things back.
For me, that's the question. It's not what do you need, it's what are you going to use it for. So I have clients who have said, well, how do we back it up? They're coming from an on-prem view of, well, actually they're backing it up for disaster recovery, not necessarily for granular functionality. So therefore, if you're backing it up in order to restore it and to say, actually, I have a service that has in some way failed and I need to restore it, that question has a different answer than, well, I want to back it up because my users are going to delete it and they're going to come back to me in a year's time when the inbuilt tools may not work. So for me, it's really important to actually ask, why are you asking for a backup solution and what are you going to use it for?
That is a good point. I mean, the question is, in terms of backing up in that sense with a third-party product, in the unimaginable scenario that the entire M365 went down, the whole of it, where are you going to restore that to?
Exactly. And I think that's the thing for me, when you look at organizations that still have a significant investment in servers and data center infrastructure, or even that way of thinking of IaaS type solutions, they're thinking about it for a different purpose, not, you want to restore a site in SharePoint. Okay, but you're going to overwrite everything that's already there and all the other changes. Is that what you really want?
Exactly.
Those are the questions that I always ask, and it changes the conversation quite significantly, because actually the expectation of how you use it isn't necessarily aligned with what the client is actually asking for.
Yeah. And I've had clients who've asked, who not necessarily because if Microsoft 365 goes down, it's going to come back at very most within days, and if it doesn't, you're not going to really have an alternative. So we rarely see people need that, but a kind of sensible conversation I've heard is that the relationship with Microsoft falls apart completely. So maybe they put up a license on there, or possibly there's debates, especially at the moment with data residency, and maybe Microsoft decides, especially for German clients, they decide to give access to the US, and that is unreasonable. So to be able to have copies of documents, of emails in a way that quickly you could potentially terminate that license. I think there's a lot deeper conversation you need to have around that, and understanding of what's in there, and making sure. But there are definitely scenarios where being able to have effectively taking your content and having it in a non-Microsoft 365 way that you could access. I can see why people would want to do that, but there's a pretty big cost for doing something like that. So you've got to have a very good reason, not just doing it for the sake of it.
Exactly.
And you'd have to back it up essentially to a different cloud. So you'd have to stick it all in AWS or Google or Alibaba.
You really would.
Yeah.
You really would.
I just wanted to cover that, because I think
it's a good one, and it depends answer very much, and I think you'll find in our community,
it's a very complex one.
Most of the people in our community, and many of the big name MVPs, two obvious ones that spring to mind, Steve Goodman and Tony Redmond, have both written articles about this exact subject recently, and they are both more or less on the fence of the opinion in general that they don't add much real value, and if you configure your M365 correctly, then you shouldn't need them. But it's going to run and run. I think this is far from over.
And I think just to add another, I guess, feature that you would use in this conversation would be records management. Depending on why you need to have those backups, if you're storing things as records, that opens up a whole new area where you can be storing those records outside of Office 365 in Azure, in other locations, because that those particular documents are of significant value and need to be retained, usually for legislative reasons. So therefore that gives you that alternate way of actually saying, I know these documents are really important, and therefore they need to be stored differently, treated differently, they need to be immutable, etc. So that adds another layer onto that conversation.
But Al, I think you hit the nail on the head. Always ask why. Make sure you're querying why, not just doing it because you used to do that. Is absolutely key.
Exactly.
Okay. I just wanted to cover that because we talked about that at the beginning, and I thought it was an important thing to say on there and to consider that. But yeah, back to licensing. I think the second topic.
So I was going to say, when we're mitigating the actions and recommendations in the compliance and security score, one of the key reasons that I see clients mitigating and absorbing risk is the license cost. And I think it's probably one of the most contentious areas when you're talking about this. So how do we convey the value of the services that you pay for with the licensing?
Oh, it's an utter minefield, the licensing. My goodness. But I always turn this decision on its head and say that to protect your business, your data, your intellectual property, you've invested in Microsoft 365. You've got to a level. You've got Office 365 E3 being the most typical plan that's adopted by most businesses and organizations. You absolutely must protect your data. Can you afford not to be leveraging these licenses that are going to enable you to do that? I talk about the risk. If you're not going to be protecting your data, then you're putting your data and your business at risk from both a security and compliance standpoint. And the most common step up beyond what we could describe that more basic Office 365 licensing is to go up to one of the enterprise mobility and security plans. The first one of which is E3. There's always an E3 and an E5 typically, with E3 having the core features, and then E5 having the some more advanced features added on to that. So, and E3 is broken. It can be broken down again into, and this is where it gets even more complex, into individual SKUs of other things. So within E3 you get Azure Information Protection P1, which gives you things like Azure AD conditional access, which is the if this happens then do that tool within Azure AD. You also get Intune, or endpoint management, which enables you to apply mobile device management and mobile application management to your business devices and any BYOD devices that you may or may not be allowing. So Intune comes with it. You also get Azure AIP, which is Azure Information Protection P1, as part of EMNS E3. That to me is incorrectly named now, because AIP is what everyone still kind of refers to it, but it's really more under the umbrella of MIP now, Microsoft Information Protection, excuse me, and sensitivity labeling, retention labeling. It's all, that's where it's going. But people still tend to call it AIP, rightly or wrongly. It's one of those names that is just stuck. And you get that as part of EMNS E3. And then finally there is no, you don't get identity protection. See, I get confused after all these years.
So I think on that, Peter, you shared with us a good link of the Microsoft 365 licensing guidance for security and compliance.
Essential. Really.
For those that can see the bar thing, it's a big old page. There's a PDF version of it, but I'm just going to scroll through and through and through and through and through. Yeah, it's a big old document on there.
Yeah.
So it's not something simple. I think for me, when people ask, I often, if you're looking at E5, you're looking at a lot of the AI-driven do things for you, give self-service, that the kind of, I don't want to say gold-plated, but the great additional things that make it easier for you to do things. That there's a lot of that within there. It's not an absolute rule, but that's what I see a lot of. As the difference between the two.
I think for me, there's two things. Again, it comes back to whether you're looking at the security or whether you're looking at the compliance. And I think the security elements for me are probably the first step, is to make sure that you are authenticating people as robustly as you can do. So making sure that you've got MFA, you've got, when people are moving online, make sure they can actually reset their own password. Some of those efficiency gains, those are tangibly measurable. How many people do you have asking you to reset your password each month? And
absolutely,
you can actually really get metrics around some of these things when you look at, your case management system for your IT department. What are they actually spending their time doing? And I think
so sorry, Al, that's self-service. That's at a particular license level you don't get with others. Is that what you're saying?
So self-service for end users to say, what can they actually manage? So their password resets and things like that. And those
you get that with higher levels.
You get that with P1. Yeah. Azure AD Premium P1 is required for self-service password reset.
And then things
so being able to justify the cost through reducing the amount of time spent doing very simple basic things.
Yeah, I know that, then you can move up to conditional access, who can do what based on who they are and where they're logging in from. And you can actually measure these quite tangibly sometimes to say this is the benefit. And as you say, Peter, measure the risk. What is the reputational risk? What is the legislative cost? If you actually violate GDPR and you get fined, what could that be? If there's legislation,
10% of turnover, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
And you kind of look at those measures and go, how do I mitigate the risk that we're going to have to pay that? What is the impact if I'm a healthcare provider that patient data gets leaked somewhere. Those are the sorts of questions to be asking. And the DPO, the data protection officer, should be well aware of those implications. At which point it's, if I can put this license in, it will reduce it by X percentage. If I put this one in, it will reduce it further.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the other thing that I've had a lot of clients do is they look at what's capable in E5 and they look at what they have already. Advanced threat protection versus some of the other virus tools. Do they need to have both? Can they offset the cost of others with some of that? Not a blanket one, not saying don't use McAfee and others, but there's a conversation to be had at looking at the capabilities of that, looking at whether you're, if you move to Teams calling, you get the E5 things, not security and compliance, but it can justify the costs of all the other great things you get from there. So looking at the broader subject and saying, well, actually, if we do this, then we wouldn't need to pay that, and you may need to tie it in with timings and when contracts are up, but there's so many things you get as part of this. You've got to consider a wider usage of it as well.
Exactly.
Consolidation of costs and retirement of other products. I think the other thing that's really important is understanding the personas in the organization. Who needs what license level? And I think that's a conversation we're having with lots of clients who have, rapidly moved to having remote workers where they didn't have them before. Well, actually, the license requirement for those people when they're working at home is now going to be slightly different than if they were working in the office. If they have a corporate device, that's great. If they're now using BYOD, maybe there's a different license level that's needed to enable that way of working. And that's the other key thing to look at is based on the way people are working, the personas in the organization, what is the appropriate license level for each of those people?
Exactly. Think about the location of your businesses as well. If you're a multi global organization, that can come into play also. So many different factors in making the decision for which license you need. Can that licensing enable you to retire other products? A good example I had only last week was a customer coming to me who were using third-party federation for their Azure AD using Okta, and they wanted to move away from that in favor of Azure AD seamless single sign-on with pass-through authentication, and there's an immediate cost saving there. Other good examples when customers coming on to 365, they may be using third-party MDM solutions, something like Mobile Iron or
AirWatch.
AirWatch, exactly.
These days,
I think the other one that I've seen quite a lot is where they're using encryption for email. Having a third party that does that. It's kind of going, well, you could remove not just the license cost but the server infrastructure. You can remove all of those things if you consolidate, and it's not just license, it's cost of ownership of other solutions and how much you can actually consolidate. Oh, well, I don't need to have an expert in these 3 different products. We just have one area of expertise.
Exactly.
I think it's important we say that it sounds like I was saying get E5, you can get away with all these things, you cannot use them. I think what we're saying is many companies have bought these products but are only using a small subset, and that subset could be done by E5. If you get these specific ones, they can often do even more things, and if you're using all that, then there is value in it.
Oh, absolutely.
But make sure you're looking at the value you're using from it, and are you getting it? That I think is what we're saying here. Make sure you've considered them properly.
Each system must be assessed in terms of what you're using it. You can't just say, actually, I'm going to retire, Mimecast or ClearSwift and just use Exchange Online. You need to make sure that you're comfortable with the differences in those systems, because there will always be differences as well.
Yeah, it has to be baby steps. And this makes me think of another common question I get asked that is not entirely related, but a number of our customers come to us and say, can we go completely cloud? Can we ditch our on-premises infrastructure? Can we do this, and can we do it yesterday? And I say, well, that is an achievable goal, but it's got to be baby steps. You've got to plan very carefully, because most businesses don't have that luxury of being born in the cloud like many startups. They they've got years of investment in LDAP and legacy applications. And
Active Directory is, I've worked with some quite large organisations that have Active Directory, and we're pumping all of our HR and user management systems. We're creating users in Active Directory, and then we want to migrate them or synchronize them up to Azure AD. Now, how do we work with all those other applications? And the minefields that you can encounter in that space.
Really is, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a whole different conversation, isn't it?
I think the answer is yes. You can go completely cloud, but not tomorrow. It's going to take a little bit of.
It's going to take some time.
Still need that one Exchange box? Do you still need the one on-prem Exchange box still?
Yes. Yeah. I listened to a podcast literally a few weeks ago where the head of Exchange was interviewed, and he said that, he didn't give anything away, as Microsoft never do, but he said, we're working on it and we want to sooner rather than later. But this mythical
2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, or
this was probably about 3 or 4
could still be the case.
But we've been talking about this ability for years, and we still have to retain an Exchange server to be supported. So
working on it is even worse than coming soon, isn't it?
Yeah.
My favourite freebie swag was an eye mask that came from one of the hackathons that said "working on it" with a little spinning logo on there, which always made me laugh. So it was, sitting on a plane, falling asleep, and saying "working on it." Made me chuckle. So talking of tomorrow, and because my stomach's rumbling quite so much and I have to keep going on mute, it's obviously almost time for lunch. But what's next? What's coming with security and compliance? And similar to what Al was talking about, hopefully a more aligned portal. What would we like to see coming? Peter first on that one.
Well, the thing that I always do to keep in touch with this, and it's important to be on the ball with this, being in the roles that we are as M365 consultants and architects, is always have the Microsoft 365 roadmap bookmarked. It's my go-to page to find out what's coming in the overall scheme of M365, but you're able to filter this by all of the subsets of products in there. And earlier this morning I went in, and Kev's doing the same here. We can see that you can filter that down to security and compliance specific technologies such as Azure Information Protection and the compliance score, and then we can see what's in development from Microsoft, what's currently rolling out, what has recently been launched. There is also a category somewhere which shows what's been abandoned, because sometimes things do get abandoned. And if you drill down into each of these, you can get more information.
That's quite interesting.
It is, yeah. You can find that somewhere. I can't quite remember off the top of my head where that is, but there is a section somewhere where you can see that, because some things don't make it all the way, and that's why you have to be careful of preview features, because usually they make it into GA, but sometimes they get taken away. So, and if Microsoft take away a preview feature, then there's really nothing you can do about it. So start using them at your peril.
I think that's a really good point, because I think certainly this space, it has such a big impact as well. And I know, one of my favorite things is entitlements. I think they're fantastic. They've been on the roadmap for a very, very long time, but they had so much feedback and they had to redesign how they were actually implementing them. And I think it's really important that, yes, don't put anything that isn't GA into a production environment.
Exactly.
Notice one on the roadmap, the export to PST for advanced EDiscovery. I was talking about that with a client the other day. I wish I'd looked at this now. Go back to on that one. That's quite useful.
Yeah.
And I think, Peter, on there you were talking about that you can get to that. You can actually download. So you can see we've taken an extract of that into Excel. Yep. So you can pull that data out if you need to put it in, Power BI, whatever other things you want to do, and you can get RSS feeds for those still lamenting Google Reader. There still are some RSS readers, and you can get alerts on that. So this isn't just about you can get updated. You don't have to keep reminding yourself to come back here. You can actually get alerted, get that event-driven approach as well.
Remember, you can add an RSS feed into Teams.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That was a good shout.
Good point.
Good shout.
I think so. What am I excited about? next week.
Entitlements you've mentioned.
I'm hoping.
I can hear your head going, what can I talk about? What can't I? Damn it.
Yeah, I'm hoping entitlements are expanded on. I think as a way of delegating permissions and associating permissions, it's massively underused. And I know every time I've shown it to clients, they've just looked at it and gone, "Oh, that's really, really good. It gives us more control, more life cycle management. Yeah, really, really good thing." And I think that'll be a big push. I think making sure that all of the different systems that we're using, just consolidating and bringing it all together so that it's consistent terminology. I always have the fun conversation of what's the difference between a retention policy and a sensitive label. It's just trying to bring those together to make it clearer and easier for clients to understand would be fantastic as well.
Yeah, there needs some work needs to be done there because it can be so confusing. Yeah, it's hard to explain sometimes as well. Sometimes these are easier in your head than they are to verbalize and make them understandable. So that some work needs to be done there.
I think one thing that I find really difficult with explaining this is just to have a simple matrix of, for each license level, what do you get with a common description? Because I have my own spreadsheet that I have to update as frequently as I use it. Yeah. But I do find that it's really difficult. It's really obscure to try and find out what you get with E1, E3, EM&S in E3, M365 E3, how you map all of the different license levels together to say, actually, these are the services that you get. For me, I think that would make it easier for us to actually pitch this to clients and explain.
I think it would be, and they've done this a little bit, but to be very, not just be very clear what they are, but make them obvious ones. And often there's a very small difference between the E3 and E5 that's very specific. And you can get quite far down using something before you hit that kind of limitation. You're like, well, I'm using that. Why can't I just do this little extra bit? So they got a bit like EDiscovery. You have EDiscovery and advanced EDiscovery. You don't go down that route quite so much. You've almost got two separate areas that give you the difference between the levels, which helps. So I think trying to take away that very small differences would be good.
The other one that I was always puts me on edge when I'm asked is, can I get away with just having one license for that?
Oh,
yeah.
And those ideally, I think they need to have some license level that says, for a tenant with this many users, this is going to cost this much, but you need this license to actually interrogate this information and use it. So there's a capture cost and an interrogation cost that are separated.
And related to that, there's a lot of risk that if you have one license, you can start using something that you're breaching the license. Cloud App Discovery is a great example that you need to have additional licenses for everyone, but it doesn't stop you doing it. So I would like to see more in place that stops you from interrogating that things if you're not licensed for it. That feels like a very Oracle way of doing things, and Microsoft has felt better than that more recently. So I'd like to see that increase.
Yeah, Office 365 ATP is another example of something that's tenant-wide activated, but if you got one license for it, it'll work for everyone. But so it's a taken on trust thing, and it's very dangerous.
Yeah, and I think people don't understand it. We've had a client that we spoke to, and that they had turned it on, and it's not that easy to sort of stop and to understand where things are. So making it very clear on that, I think that would be a good improvement for people. And I think we'll probably encourage them to get E5s. If you had a very clear understanding, then people would have some E5s, or have it in, there may be particular teams that need it, and there may be particular teams that don't. Being clearer, I think, would sell more licenses, whereas people tend to get nervous and don't do anything. Rather, the logic is that people will buy a lot more. They don't. They buy less. So I think that would be good.
Exactly.
No idea if that is coming, but
we shall see.
It's interesting looking through this roadmap. I haven't looked at the security and compliance for a while. A lot of these are very, very specific things. It's to the low level. It doesn't feel like there's some big elements coming within this. I'd say that's one problem with the roadmap. It's quite hard to delineate between the massively new things and a single, well, we'll do this one little improvement that you can export to PDF instead of just to Excel, that kind of thing. It's got both levels within there. It's not always easy to delineate between what the different ones are. But,
Exactly.
check on Ignite, I think. There's lots
Absolutely.
of sessions there. And do either you know, because I think one of the great things about, one of the awful things about Ignite is that session catalog is huge, and trying to find what you want to see from that is not great. But there are often a lot of things with the tech community and the blogs that are sort of going out there. And
I've got a visitor.
There's some blogs that highlight the good sessions to come and join on. I will try and find and see if there's some security and compliance ones.
I think I've got some links for that. I'll try and dig some of those out.
Yeah, if you've got them out there, we'll put those in the show notes. I think the fact we're being interrupted both by my stomach and various children coming there, and I can hear my wife starting to stomp around upstairs, probably means we need to start to bring a halt
It
to
might be time
today's
to call
recording.
it, yes.
We are real, we do have family, we do have a real life, even if I don't have anything to do apart from be locked down in the house this weekend. Not that I'm bitter about that at all.
You're
I'm
not
very
bitter
on these podcasts, aren't I, in the last few months?
You're not bitter at all, are you?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Yes, I'll try and change that for next week. I'll be too excited after Ignite. I'll lose all my bitterness by looking at all the details from that.
We will wait with bated breath to see
Yeah.
how satisfied you are with everything that comes out.
Absolutely. Peter, I'd like to put the last word on you. Why should we care about security compliance in Microsoft 365?
Because the alternative is unthinkable. If we don't care, then we're putting ourselves at extreme risk, and it's hard closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. So be proactive, be diligent, take steps to protect your Microsoft 365 environment, and if you work from that principle, it'll be worth it and you won't regret it. Simple as that.
I think that's a great wrap up. Absolutely agree. So thank you very much for joining us again. I hope you have a great time next week in enjoying all that Ignite has to offer, and
yeah, likewise.
You're given the time to actually consume some of it.
I'm sure I will. I will make the time. Absolutely sure.
Otherwise, we will be back in 2 weeks' time. I'm not sure what we're talking about, so we probably need to have a chat about that, Al, and need to plan a little bit ahead. Still not found the time to do that properly, but we've got some great ideas of shows coming up, and some great people lined up as guests. So keep an eye on the Twitter feed and on the website, and otherwise we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much. I've been Gray.
I've been Hat.
And Peter's been a nice standing beard. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you very much.
Speak to you again in a couple of weeks.
Bye.
Bye now.